everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you all back to another English video for the continuation of our series called Studies of the Brit Hadasha. For today's video, we're going to continue analyzing the good news of Mark, and we're going to be focusing in chapters 7 and 8. For today's study, the title is Seeing with Faith the Things of Elohim and Guarding Against the Leaven of Men. Starting off with Mark 7 verses 1 to 5, it says, The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. Verse 3, The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless washing their hands. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Verse 5. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Yeshua, Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? As we read within these first 5 verses of chapter 7, it says that the Pharisees came to Yeshua and asked him why his disciples didn't wash their hands before eating. Let's remember that the Pharisees were a group of religious people who observed not only the Torah, but also the laws that the elders had already added in the oral tradition, which is called the Talmud. The problem with these religious people, and that we have been seeing and studying within these 2 Gospels, Matthew and Mark, is that the Pharisees gave more importance to the laws given by the religious elders or by men, and not the laws given directly from the Eternal, which are the laws of the Torah. The reason why I am mentioning about these human-made laws or these religious laws is because within these verses, it's precisely what caused this problem between the Pharisees and Yeshua's disciples. As we read in these verses, the Pharisees, due to their strictness, they observed the people around them to make sure that they followed their instructions or their laws. So when they realized that Yeshua's disciples didn't do so with this tradition of the washing of hands, they condemned them as if they were transgressing the laws of the Torah, which, as we have been studying, the laws of the Torah are more important than the human or the religious laws. This washing of hands that we can read within these verses, it's a Jewish tradition, just as we read in these verses, and which is also practiced till this day. This tradition is called Netilat Yadayim, found in the Talmud. This tradition calls for the washing of hands every morning and every time it is going to be eaten. It serves as a reminder to use their hands for holy purposes. This tradition is done with a prayer that is said by the person, where basically they bless Hashem, or also known as God, for the divine commandments that are given to them, and for the commandment regarding to the washing of hands, which, as we read within these verses, it was not a commandment given by the Eternal, but it was a commandment added to the religious laws of Judaism. For those who do not know, the Talmud, which was written between the 3rd to the 6th century, is a central religious text in Judaism, essentially a compilation of rabbinical interpretations and commentaries based on the Torah, serving as a primary source of the Jewish law called Halakha, and providing guidance. And the Talmud provides guidance on various aspects of Jewish life, ethics, and customs. Its significance lies in its roles as a foundation of Jewish religious practice and thought for centuries, shaping Jewish culture and providing a framework for interpreting the Torah in everyday situations. The Talmud consists of 2 parts. One part is the Mishnah, which is a codified collection of Jewish laws, and the other part, or the second part, is the Gemara, which are rabbinical discussions and commentaries on the Mishnah. Also, there are two main versions of the Talmud. One version is the Babylonian Talmud, which it is said that it is considered more authoritative than the second version of the Talmud, which is the Jerusalem Talmud. So, seeing and understanding this problem with the religious people about this commandment of washing their hands before eating, which is not a law of the Torah but a human law, helps us understand the reason why Yeshua calls the Pharisees hypocrites. And this word hypocrites, or this name hypocrite, can be viewed as a pretty strong word, or even as a mean word, disrespectful word. But the reason why Yeshua calls the Pharisees hypocrites was because they clung to the commandments of men and invalidated the instruction of the Eternal by their tradition. In verses 6-5, it says that this was something that the prophet Isaiah had already mentioned that was going to occur with the religious people. And we can find this in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13, where it says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of Elohim and hold to the tradition of men." For this reason, it is why Yeshua called the Pharisees hypocrites, because they approached the Eternal not because they loved him, nor with a genuine desire to serve him, but because it benefited them, made them appear as holy people, and strengthened their social position in the community. They even taught others, and this is something that Yeshua says within these verses of chapter 7 of Mark, is that these religious people taught the others that they could stop fulfilling the commandments of the Eternal, such as honoring their parents, in order to give offerings to the temple, leaving without any validity what was really important, which was the laws or the instructions of the Eternal. This is something that is still occurring till this day, because in the religions, we can see that the people with power try to add laws and regulations to the word of the Eternal in order to support their sins as something that is already permitted. And they say they say that this is the grace. And all of this causes much confusion, but also it causes people to make bigger transgressions in their lives. So understanding all of this that was occurring with the religious people, and that continues to happen with today's religious people, it mainly teaches us a lesson about the importance that if we call ourselves disciples of the Messiah, then we must search the scriptures and guide ourselves with the scriptures, which we know that are based on the correct interpretation that is given to us by Yeshua, who, as we have studied within these two gospels, and that we are also going to continue studying with the rest of the studies that are based on the Brit Hadasha, Yeshua is the only one that the Father has sent to bring us closer to him. And in this way, we will not be confused by all of these religious laws or traditions that are active nowadays. And in the case of the disciples, Yeshua was with them so he can guide them and feed them with the spiritual food, which is the word of the Eternal, so that they won't be distracted or won't fall into those traditions, to those religious traditions. So this is something that we can see within these first verses found in chapter 7. Continuing with verses 14 to 23, it narrates about what Yeshua says to his disciples regarding to what defiles a person, or what makes a person impure. After this situation that had occurred with the Pharisees and Yeshua's disciples, which was the situation about the washing of hands, it says in these verses that Yeshua then calls the people to him and tells them to listen to what he was going to say, but most importantly, to understand his words. Since Yeshua was going to say a parable, and these people needed to stop and reflect in this parable, in the words of the Messiah, so they could understand his words and the hidden message that was found in this parable. As we have studied in previous parables that are found in Mark and in Matthew, not everything that was said about that was said in these parables could be interpreted as something literal, since the main purpose of the parables were for the people who had the ability to understand. Well, first of all, it was these parables were for the people who wanted to listen to them and therefore had the ability to understand the hidden message and then apply that message or that lesson to their lives. But in this case, in this parable of the Messiah regarding to what makes a person impure, which as we read within these verses, it says, or Yeshua says, that a person does not become impure by what they eat, but by what comes out of that person. And well, what we can read within this parable that Yeshua says in these verses, it has been misinterpreted. Um, and it has also caused the people to believe that the Messiah has authorized the persons or the humans to eat whatever they want. In other words, that the kosher laws found within the Torah are no longer valid. And this obviously and logically cannot be true, because we do not if we do not fulfill the commandments regarding or to the kosher laws, or if we do not fulfill the kosher laws, then we will be, or we would be, invalidating the Torah. And that was precisely what Yeshua was claiming from the Pharisees, that they invalidated the Torah and they decided to fulfill the laws of the religious elders. So it would be kind of, therefore, seeing what the people say regarding to this parable of Yeshua, that the kosher laws are no longer are valid. It wouldn't make sense that Yeshua would say that, because Yeshua could not be ordering the people to do the same thing, invalidating the Torah like the Pharisees were doing, since it would be a contradiction on the part of Yeshua. Rather, reading these verses, we can understand that Yeshua explains that what his disciples had eaten would not contaminate them just because they didn't wash their hands, or they didn't perform this ritual of washing their hands, since the food that they ate was kosher food. And Yeshua says that that was not what was going to contaminate them, or that was not going to make them impure. But what makes, or what truly contaminates or makes a person impure, is what comes out of that person, such as bad thoughts, the pride, their ego, making additions to the Torah, stealing, committing adultery, lying, sinning, etc. All of those bad fruits are what contaminates a person, what makes a person impure. And seeing or reading and understanding this parable that Yeshua was saying for the people to listen to it, and just as we read in the beginning of these verses, to not only listen but to truly have the ears to understand what Yeshua was saying. Well, seeing all of this that Yeshua, or reading these words of Yeshua, it teaches us a important lesson as believers, which is to examine our lives every day and take care of ourselves to keep our hearts clean. Because in this way, everything we externalize will be in ordinance with the will of the Eternal, and we will be able to be approved by Him, just as we can read in Philippians 4 verses 8 to 5, which says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, just, pure, lovely, is of good report, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Verse 9. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the eternal of peace will be with you. So here it teaches us a very big lesson that we must not get distracted and not fall into these religious traditions that are given by men, and we must stay focused in our calling, always making sure to fulfill the will of the eternal, and be careful that whatever comes out of us does not contaminate us and does not make us impure. We must always be giving good fruits, just as we read in Philippians that we must practice everything that we see in the Messiah, his good fruits, so that in that way the eternal of peace will be with us. Continuing with verses 24 to 30, it narrates about the Syrophoenician woman's faith. In these verses, it first starts saying that Yeshua traveled about 45 kilometers to Tyre and from there to Sidon. Both of these places were two Mediterranean port cities which were located in the northern part of Israel, and these places had a flourishing trade and were very prosperous. In this case, we can read that Yeshua wanted to remain unknown. He didn't want the people to notice that Yeshua was in this place, but we read that he failed so, since once again we can read that his fame had already spread to that place. And among the people who knew about Yeshua's fame and what he was doing, the miracles that he was performing, there was this woman who came up to him because her daughter had an unclean spirit and she wanted her daughter to be healed. In this Gospel of Mark, it says that she was a Syrophoenician, but in the Gospel of Matthew, we read that she was called a Canaanite. In this case, Mark's description refers to her in a political background, since the Roman audience could easily identify her by the part of the empire that she came from. But in Matthew's description, the reason why she was identified as a Canaanite was because that was how she was seen or identified by the Israelite audience, who had the Canaanites as bitter enemies when Israel had settled in the Promised Land. So, seeing both of these descriptions found in Matthew and in Mark, it is quite surprising to see that this woman, despite her being a Gentile and therefore not having any knowledge of the Torah, because she was a woman that lived in the nations and they didn't have the Torah of the eternal, they didn't have the instruction of the eternal. It is surprising to see that although she was a Gentile, she still believed that Yeshua could be the only one who could draw away this unclean spirit from her daughter. In other words, we can read how this woman had faith in the Messiah. But although this woman did have faith in the Messiah, we can read that when she asks Yeshua for this liberation of this unclean spirit in her daughter, Yeshua's response is pretty forceful or pretty direct. The reason why I say this is because we read in these verses that Yeshua replies, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." We can read in this verse that pretty harsh words are being said, but with this response that Yeshua gives, Yeshua was referring that the people of Israel were the children who had to receive the bread, the word of the eternal, and that it was not correct to take the food, the word of the eternal, and give it to the dogs, which represents the nations. So these words, although they do sound harsh, and it could have caused the woman to get offended and even leave that place by the way that Yeshua responds, but we can read that she was firm in her decision. She decided to stay despite this response of Yeshua being a bit too harsh. She decided to stay. And in this, We in this decision, this action that this woman takes, we can see that she did this because she had faith. She understood that these words were intended to not only test her heart, but most importantly to test her faith. We can continue reading in these verses that she did not give up on that answer that Yeshua gave her. On the contrary, we can read that she continued to insist of this for this liberation of her daughter. She humbly acknowledged her condition as a Gentile because her desire to receive that spiritual nourishment that the Messiah brought was so much bigger than what she could have felt emotionally, what she could have felt in the moment that she heard Yeshua's words. And we can read in these verses that Yeshua, seeing the way that this woman acted, that the way that this woman took this choice of staying and insisting, Yeshua recognized this woman's faith, and for this reason, it is why we read that this woman's girl, her daughter, was healed from that unclean spirit. So, reading and analyzing this situation that occurs with this Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, it shows us that the nations were also waiting for the Messiah. They had faith in the Messiah, because he, as we have studied and as we're going to continue studying, Yeshua is that light that the Eternal sent for all of those who wish to come closer to him through the Messiah. And in this case, this woman was seeing this light, and this woman took the opportunity of this light to receive a healing, but most importantly, to receive that spiritual nourishment that was only and that could only be found through the Messiah. Finally, or to finalize this chapter, verses 31 to 37, it is narrated that Yeshua heals a deaf man. Once again, Yeshua in these verses performs another miracle of healing. And this time it was in the area or in the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis, which is referring to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. We can read in these verses that in this place there was a man who alludes to the condition of the nations, whom because of their transgression, and their hardened hearts, they were prevented from hearing and speaking the word of the Creator. And this is where precisely this miracle happens, in this place where they didn't have they were prevented of hearing and speaking the word of the Eternal. But we can read in this miracle that is narrated in these verses that through Yeshua, this person receives restoration of vision and also of hearing, representing the people of the nations, whom through Yeshua we have all received that opportunity of restoration of vision and hearing, talking spiritual wise. And we now all have, or all of those who have now entered the covenant of Yeshua, can divulge the wonders of the Eternal without hindrance, so that others may know the freedom he has granted to us and which we have received the blessing. So in this healing of this deaf man that we read in from these verses 31 to 35, it mainly teaches us, or it makes us reflect on how the people of the nations, they still received that spiritual food of the Messiah. They received those miracles from the Messiah, which were of great testimony for them. And in some people, it brought faith to them, and therefore they had that opportunity to return to the Father through Yeshua. In other words, we can see how the Eternal, despite humanity having their hearts rebelled against the Eternal still sends his light, still sends his anointed Son to go to these nations so that they can also receive those promises, receive those blessings, and receive that spiritual food that was brought through Yeshua. And how even till our days, we still have the opportunity to receive that restoration of vision and of hearing. Once again, all of this was referring to spiritualness. Continuing with Mark chapter 8 verses 1 to 10, it starts narrating about this big miracle that Yeshua once again does, which is feeding the 4,000 people who were gathered to hear what Yeshua had to say. Once again, we can read that Yeshua is surrounded by a great number of people, and this was because his fame had spread widely, and because of this, the people would come to him from all over the nations. In two previous chapters, chapter 6 verses 30 to 44, we studied about the feeding of the 5,000 people, where we read that the Messiah also shows compassion to these people, which were Israelites, because the multitude was like a sheep without a shepherd. He saw in these people their need to receive that spiritual food, the word of the eternal. But in this case, in these verses of chapter 8, we can read that the case is a bit different, since the multitude was made up, or this multitude was of Gentiles and not Israelites, as it was in the case of the previous feeding. Yet we can read that Yeshua still showed them kindness despite these people being Gentiles. Yeshua, we can read that he was with them for 3 days, teaching them and for sure performing healings and miracles. We can read that Yeshua did not reject these Gentiles, but on the contrary, he took the time to share the good news with them, allowing them to receive that true spiritual food so that their souls would be satisfied. But we can read that since these people had already been with Yeshua for 3 days, they had not eaten. And Yeshua didn't want to send these people home hungry and take the risk of fainting on their way home, because we read in these verses that some of these people did live far away. So we can see that Yeshua wanted to or feeds these 4,000 people, and the disciples, hearing that Yeshua wanted to feed these 4,000 people, they questioned or they doubted themselves, saying, "Where will anyone be able to satisfy these people with bread here in the desert?" And seeing this response of the disciples, it was something that was not expected by them, for them to react that way, because after all, they had been there to see, or they had been seeing all the miracles and all the miracles that Yeshua had done. So once again, in these verses, we can see this doubt in the disciples, and it seems that they thought that it was impossible for such an event to happen again, this feeding of the 4,000. And although, yes, we can read that they believed in Yeshua and they were willing to serve the eternal, but we can see by their response that they still had not fully understood what was happening. Analyzing this reaction of the disciples, it makes us reflect on the importance of not only believing in the Messiah, but also believing him. In other words, believing the words of the Messiah. Always having his words and works in our minds so that our faith can be firm. As believers, we find ourselves as pilgrims in the desert, which represents the world. Being in this world, we know that we have to go through trials and afflictions, and we cannot forget the power of Elohim and everything he has done for us, and above all, the promises we've received through Yeshua. The Eternal has given us the spiritual word through his son Yeshua, so that in the midst of any situation, any hard situation that we can find ourselves in, we can persevere no matter how difficult the circumstance can be, whether it be really, really difficult or whether it be a light circumstance. In all of this, it helps us, but it also takes us to a lesson that we must not doubt that our Father will fulfill what he has promised, or even that he takes care of us. With this, it teaches us that we have to continue toward the goal of the promises and obedience, looking with faith at the things of the eternal and not looking at the things of the earth. In this case of the disciples, although at that time they did not understand what was going on or what Yeshua was doing, we can read later on in their lives that they give us a great example of perseverance, remaining faithful despite all the oppositions, all the trials that they went through. We can see later on in their lives that they no longer doubted in what was happening, but they made every effort and even got to exhort the rest of the believers to remain in faith until the coming of the Messiah. Returning to what we can read in these verses, it says that Yeshua prayed to the Eternal so he could allow the 7 loaves and the small fishes to be enough to feed all of the 4,000 people. This is exactly what happened. It says in these verses that the food was given to the multitude and that they were satisfied. Even we can read that there was leftovers. Here we can notice that nothing is impossible for the Eternal. He is able to do things more abundantly than we can even ask for or that we can even understand. And this teaches us a great lesson to never doubt in the Eternal, just how had occurred with the disciples in that time. We must not act in that way. We must always understand, and even if we don't understand what is going on, we must always believe that the Eternal can do things that we probably would never imagine that could be possible. Lastly, in this event that is narrated of the feeding of the 4,000, it contains an allusion to what would happen in the future. For example, when it says or when it mentions the 4,000 people, it is referring to the 4 cardinal points of the earth. The 7 loaves of bread refer to the fact that the spiritual food was complete or perfect to be fed on. The few small fishes refer to the remnant of the nations that had to be caught. And lastly, the 7 leftover baskets of food refer to the fact that there would be enough food for everyone. With this miracle, the Messiah was announcing to his disciples that they would not only have to bring the food or the word of the Eternal to the people of Israel, but also to the people of the nations, the Gentiles, of which a remnant would receive that perfect food and be satisfied with it. And this is precisely what the Messiah had announced regarding of what would occur in the final great harvest, where he said that the remnant, who represents the good wheat, will be kept in the granary of the Almighty, and the weeds will be thrown into the fire. So we can see that, and although the disciples didn't understand what was going on with this miracle that Yeshua did on the feeding of the 4,000, we can see in analyzing this miracle, we can see that it had a very, very big message, on what was going to happen in the future with the disciples, and that we can even see in the letters of the apostles that it was fulfilled. From verses 11 to 14, it narrates that Yeshua went to the district of Dalmanutha, where the Pharisees began once again to argue with Yeshua. And the reason why they started arguing was because they did not believe in Yeshua, just as we have been studying throughout these 2 Gospels, that these Pharisees were not satisfied with all the works that the Messiah was doing. And for this reason, in these verses, the Pharisees demanded that Yeshua, or they asked Yeshua for more signs for him to prove that he was the Messiah that was sent by the Eternal. We know that Yeshua could give them all the signs that they could ask for. But Yeshua, in this case, he knew that even if he did give them signs that he was the Messiah, these people would not believe him. They did not look with faith at the things of Elohim, because the Messiah that they were waiting for were based or were according to their religious traditions, to their religious laws, and to what them as humans wanted for the Messiah to do. Even if Yeshua did many more signs to prove that he was a Messiah, they were not going to give in, because they did not obey the Eternal, but rather they obeyed their tradition. That was their primary thing that they had to fulfill their traditions, to fulfill their religious laws. Their hearts, and just as we have been reading in this gospel, their hearts were hardened. They only wanted to tempt Yeshua so that they can make him look ridiculous, and therefore the people could stop believing in him. But we can read that that was not the case. And for this reason, it is why Yeshua tells them in these specific verses of chapter 8, he tells them, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." Yeshua here, we can read that he was disappointed with this attitude of these people. These people should have recognized Yeshua as the Messiah, because they have been claiming since years before to be very knowledgeable about the Torah. And for this reason, it is why Yeshua was putting them into practice and everything that had been written about him. But we can read here in these verses that the Pharisees were lying about them having knowledge of the Torah. Their fear of the Eternal was guided by the commandments of men. They were not doers of the Torah, but they invalidated it. They did not even believe Moshe, because just as we read in these verses, the Messiah says that if they did believe in Moshe and in what he would say, then they would also believe Yeshua, because all the prophets, including Moshe, spoke about him. But the religious people, they were blinded by their religion. They were not willing to renew their minds to receive that new wine that the Messiah brought. And therefore, they just didn't want to accept that Yeshua was the Messiah. Once again, in these verses, it takes us to reflect on the importance of faith. Because if we are not willing to believe Yeshua, to look with faith at the things of Elohim, to deny ourselves and therefore renew our mind, then we will not receive revelation, and we will also not be able to discern the will of the Father. We cannot be rebels like the Pharisees, who wanted things to happen their way and serve the Eternal according to their traditions. We must understand that we have to look at Yeshua as that perfect testimony of how we should act and live, as if we call ourselves true believers, and if we call ourselves sons and daughters of the Almighty. So this really does teach us a lesson to reflect and to analyze the way that we live, the way that we act, the way that we talk, our testimony, our fruits, so that we do not fall into this hypocrisy that was precisely what we can see, or that is precisely what we can see within the lives of these religious people. Continuing with verses 15 to 21 of chapter 8, it narrates that the disciples continued discussing between each other about what had happened previously in the feeding of the 4,000. And the reason why they continued to discuss about this situation was because they just simply didn't understand the important message of this miracle. Yeshua, hearing this discussion, tells his disciples that their hearts were dull, because at that moment they were not looking with faith at the things of Elohim. They continued to think in a earthly way. They needed to continue renewing their minds to achieve those spiritual eyes and ears. And in this in these words that Yeshua gives to his disciples regarding to the discussion that they were having of the 4,000 people, the feeding of the 4,000 people, it teaches us that as believers, even in our days, we need to pay attention to the words of the Messiah, always reflecting and studying them, because it is not enough to just believe or to just read the words of the Messiah. We must also learn to look forward with faith in the things that the Messiah teaches us. It is important that we constantly seek communion with our Father and dedicate time to the study of the scriptures, so in that way we can receive that spiritual revelation and the holy breath or the Ruach HaKodesh gives us. Because if we do not study and if we do not take time to have that communion with our Father, then we are not going to receive the spiritual blessings. We're not going to receive the true revelation that the holy breath gives us. We are not going to understand the purposes of Elohim, and we are going to be like disciples in that time who didn't understand what was going on because their hearts were dual. They didn't understand, and therefore they couldn't understand the message that was given. So this teaches a lesson to always analyze the scriptures, to take that time to seek communion with our Father, so we can understand the purpose of the Father in our lives. Finally, to finish with today's study, with today's chapters, verses 22 to 38. First, verses 22 to 26, we can read about another healing miracle that Yeshua does towards this blind man who receives his sight. In these verses, it says that Yeshua continues to fulfill what was prophesied about him, bringing healings or healing the people who found themselves sick, talking spiritually. So this is something that we can see within verses 22 to 26. And from verses 27 to 38, we read that the Messiah wanted his disciples to be clear about his true identity. And the reason why Yeshua decides to tell his disciples his identity was because in the crowd there was two things that were being said about Yeshua. Some people were saying that Yeshua was John the Baptist, and other people were saying that he was the Elijah who was to come. So for this reason, it is why Yeshua found it quite important to make it clear to his disciples about who he was. In this way, his disciples, hearing these two point of views of the crowd or of the people, they wouldn't get distracted or even misleaded of who Yeshua was. The Eternal revealed to all the emissaries through Peter, and something that we are going to be later on reading in the letters of the apostles. We're going to be seeing that the Eternal revealed to all the emissaries through Peter that Yeshua was the Messiah sent by the Eternal. And as it says in the Good News of Mark, which we have already studied, that the congregation will be built on that truth. And this is exactly what has happened till our days. The Messiah also spoke to his disciples within these verses about everything that he would have to go through, what he was going to suffer, how he would have to die, how he was going to get mistreated by the people, by the religious people, and how the Eternal was going to raise him from the dead. So in these verses, we can read that Peter, hearing everything that Yeshua was telling them about what was going to happen to him, Peter tells Yeshua that he was not going to allow any evil thing to happen to Yeshua. But we can read in these verses that Yeshua strongly exhorts Peter, because at that time he was focusing on all the earthly things. He was looking at it in his human eyes, and it was important that they learned to set their sights on the things of the Eternal. They had to understand what Yeshua was saying, and the reason why Yeshua exhorts Peter was for Peter to understand of everything that was happening, which had to obviously occur, so the Messiah can fulfill his calling to this earth. And once again, we can read that the reason why the Eternal was going to allow all of this to happen to Yeshua was because his plans are always greater. So here, once again, we receive a teaching from the Messiah, which is that we must learn to deny ourselves, take the reproach from the world, and follow Yeshua regardless of anything or anyone else. And in this way, we can save our souls. And just as the title of this video says, we must always make sure that we see with faith the things of Elohim, just as the disciples did at some point in their lives. And we must guard ourselves against the leaven of men, just as the disciples did in their lives. So this teaches us that we must be alert of all the leaven that is all the leaven of men that can make us fall, and we must not have our eyes in the religious things or in the worldly things, but we must have our sight or our eyes directly on the things of Elohim, having faith in the things of Elohim. And well, that is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next one.